Welcome back to the Hardware Unbox podcast for episode 103. We made a video on Hardware Unbox talking about ray tracing, which seems to have upset at least some people. It's gotten maybe mixed feedback is the best way of putting it. So we're going to, I guess, expand upon our thoughts that we shared in that video. We're going to talk about some of the criticism. We're going to be talking about how we see ray tracing and largely how it relates to Nvidia's original marketing of it back in 2018 with the RTX 20 series, which was the original point of the video. So yeah, let's get into it. You know, Steve's made a video where that annoys people on the internet when I get a message early in the morning saying, "Oh, do you want to record a podcast?" And I'm like, I reckon I know what this is about. I reckon this is about the ray tracing video that you made earlier on the Hardware Unbox channel this week. And I feel like you have a few thoughts that you might want to share about some of the feedback to that video. Have I gotten it right? Is that why I've been dragged in to do this podcast episode?
You've got it a little bit right. When you say I made the video, I think you really should say we made the video.
Well, that is probably something to get into, right? Yes.
It was sort of my idea. I led with it, but yeah, it was definitely a we content piece.
Yeah, that's right. I did write some of the script. So for people that, you know, sometimes we see comments saying on either one of our videos, Steve has such bad opinions, Tim has good opinions, or vice versa.
True.
Well, it may be true. In this case, we actually did both write this script. So both of our opinions are in this one. But of course, we're talking about was ray tracing a scam video, which at least in the YouTube side of things actually got fairly standard feedback, I would have said. A lot of people sort of, maybe the content resonated with them, what they're feeling about the current PC gaming landscape, but then on other platforms, Reddit, X/Twitter, whatever, maybe a bit more negative is probably the best way of putting it. So
certainly accurate.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's probably a few things that you want to lead off with in terms of this video. So how did you see the feedback?
Highly predictable.
Yeah.
I mean, we did talk about this before the video went live, and we're like, well, Reddit's not going to like this video. All the usual suspects on X aren't going to like this video. But I'm fairly confident the broader audience is going to be pretty much on the same page. Wasn't sure exactly how on the same page they were going to be, but I didn't think we missed the mark too badly. Anyway, as it turns out, it was people overwhelmingly agreed with the video and really seemed to appreciate and enjoy the video. For those wondering, the like ratio was over 95%, which is, a healthy video. So not controversial with the audience at the present time. Over 15,000 likes. It's approaching 200,000 views. So it's been a successful video for us. And, the broader gaming community seems to very much agree with our opinions on ray tracing, but probably more to how it pertains to things like the GeForce RTX 20 series, how that all played out and how we saw that. And I think that was really my motivation for making this video. And the main the main motivation behind the video was to recap and look at how things played out based on what we were promised. And it's a really rich history, this, because, we got the promise of ray tracing. It was a rocky start for Nvidia. A few games supported it. The ones that did, not very good for the most part. But there was this huge emphasis on ray tracing for reviews from that point forward. And I remember it was this sort of arm wrestle almost with the audience, because people who didn't really know whether they wanted ray tracing or not wanted to see it tested more and featured more in the reviews. And we're sort of sitting here going, well, ray tracing doesn't seem particularly practical on most of these GPUs. There are so few examples of games that support ray tracing. There are even fewer examples of games where we believe you should even entertain using ray tracing. So when you take, gaming at large on board, like you look at it through a broad lens, not the narrow lens we're often accused of looking at gaming from, it didn't seem like a feature that you should be basing above all other features, or even a primary feature, whether it be now or in the future. And we don't like making these future promises with reviews. And it just seemed very self-evident that despite the fact that it was being pushed as this universal feature that was going to revolutionize computer graphics, and you absolutely wanted a GPU that could do hardware accelerated ray tracing because bees knees or whatever they're trying to push. And I'm sitting here going, yeah, okay, that's all neat and whatever, but I can't see this being a feature that anyone who primarily plays, let's say, competitive shooters or maybe strategy games is going to care all that much for. So if that's the case, how much do we weigh our reviews on recommending this feature? If for a huge amount of gamers, it's probably going to be a useless feature, which, in my opinion, 8 years later, it absolutely has proven to be a useless feature for competitive shooters. I think that's reasonable enough to say. And if you agree with that, then that is the very reason why we didn't heavily weight our reviews back then and even today on ray tracing. Though ray tracing has become, as I said in the video, much more. Don't know the exact word to use. I was going to say mainstream. I wouldn't call it mainstream, but it's certainly become much more mainstream than it was back in 2018, 2019, 2020, for example.
I think the thing that's, I don't know whether this surprised me or not based on the feedback to the video, is I guess how narrow the view is of people critical of our views on ray tracing. So the people who are more positive
Mm,
towards ray tracing. I say that because, PC gaming is not just immersive AAA single player games, which I think is sort of the best case, example of ray tracing. People were sort of talking about our video being like, why didn't you use examples like Resident Evil 9 or, these new games that support path tracing features and use, are sort of the better examples of ray tracing. But when you sort of go back and you have a look at what NVIDIA was saying about ray tracing at the launch of the 20 series, it was never really with this caveat that it's for a certain audience of gamers. It was really more about, this is the next big leap in gaming. Like the 10 series is now extremely outdated because it doesn't support RTX features. The 20 series, this is the starting point for what is going to be an ongoing future of gaming. And the people who say that those cards age really well might have a point based on the DLSS and upscaling side of things. But on the ray tracing side of things, I don't think, and this I guess was a lot of the point in the video, I don't think NVIDIA has proven that ray tracing is necessary or good for a large number of games that people play. And while these, like if I'm looking at, for example, the Steam charts of what people are playing right now on PC on Steam, these are not games I personally would play. So my opinion towards what ray tracing does for the games I play is going to be different. But when
mhm,
you're reviewing a product, you kind of have to look at the overall market of what people are using games for. And the benchmarks that you do are designed to be representative of all types of games. And it can be very difficult to test some of these games, which is why you may swing more towards testing representative single player titles. But if you just look
mhm,
through the top 10 games that are played right now on Steam, the overwhelming most played game by far is Counter-Strike 2. And then you've got games like Dota 2, PUBG, Apex Legends, Marvel Rivals, Rainbow Six Siege, Arc Raiders, Delta Force, Overwatch, Warframe, and Rust, a couple of these types of games. These are the titles that are by far the most successful at the moment and are ongoing successes for people. So if
mhm,
you wanted to play a game, and you brought this up in your video, like Apex Legends, people aren't generally saying, I want to play that at high visual quality levels. They're
mhm,
more like, what do I need to play this game at the levels of performance that I need to be good and have a fun time playing that particular title? And so I feel like a lot of this criticism that's sort of going, well, you've sort of tried to make this point that, multiplayer is not a good representation of ray tracing, as if like, oh, that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that ray tracing wasn't going to be good for multiplayer games at this point, as if this is some sort of big point, right? But what was the first game that we got with ray tracing? It was Battlefield 5. Like the very
mhm.
first title that NVIDIA used to demonstrate ray tracing was a multiplayer title. And so,
And Battlefield 6 never
and
got it.
Battlefield, yeah, they removed the feature from the game in future versions of the game. I think Battlefield 2042 had a cut down version of ray tracing. I think they removed the reflections and they just offered ambient occlusion and they removed it entirely for Battlefield 6. So this isn't, I feel like this shouldn't be overly controversial to say that it wasn't advertised as single player only back when it was first announced. It was announced as a thing for all gamers, a must have for everyone. And I don't think you could say that it should be no surprise to anyone that it's not useful for multiplayer 8 years later, because I don't think that's what was promised. I think it was promised that this is the direction gaming is moving in, and all games are going to shift over to be using this technology. But I think in your
Mhm.
video, you made some really great points about how not only wouldn't you use it in multiplayer games because of the performance side of things, but also from the visual side, which is something I think gets lost a little bit with the sort of, why do people use competitive settings? Why aren't people just cranking things up to ultra? Because the mentality for single player gamers is so different. You tend to want to run at the higher quality settings where possible. So yeah, I think that really is sort of, yeah, again, like I said, the feedback is just a little strange when PC gaming as a whole is not just the enthusiast gaming community playing the latest AAA single player titles. And maybe people don't realize how popular a lot of these PC games are. Like
Mhm.
Counter-Strike 2 is being played right now by more than double the amount of players than the second most popular game on Steam.
And more people play Fortnite.
Yeah, that's right. So,
So these are huge games. They're not niche games. They're not, edge cases. And to add to what you were just talking about, which gets lost in this discussion and was, again, the focal point of the video. The video wasn't saying ray tracing was a scam, by the way. So just to make that clear.
mhm,
Um, but the criticism of how ray tracing was used was the fact that you were sold a product based on false claims of what it could do
mhm.
in relation to ray tracing, which is what the video opened with. I feel like I couldn't have made that much clearer. Back in 2018, Nvidia announced the GeForce RTX 20 series, claiming that ray tracing would revolutionize computer graphics. They made many other claims. They absolutely marketed those GPUs as must buys to experience this new technology, ray tracing, how powerful it was, how much it was going to change games. Real time ray tracing was all the rage, and Nvidia was saying as much. Like the technology was used to sell you on these products that really, outside of ray tracing, weren't much better than Pascal for the most part.
Mhm.
Like they were actually worse value. But how do you get someone to upgrade from Pascal to what is arguably a worse value product? You tell them this new product does something that Pascal can't do at all, and you absolutely aren't going to want to miss out on that. And, they use the media as they often do, at least media that are compliant with that sort of thing to, weaponize that messaging to, encourage buying them pre-sale because what is it? What was the saying? How much of your life do you want to be?
Oh, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So we've seen that tactic used time and time again. They did it more recently with the RTX 5060 launch, but I don't want to get sidetracked. The point is ray tracing, ray tracing was used to sell the RTX 20 series.
Yeah.
Like that's why we are critical of those claims because it was used to extract money from gamers. And I don't think people quite get that with that. Like if Nvidia just said, "Hey, the new Turing architecture, it does this, that, and the other thing, and we're now offering hardware to support real-time ray tracing." Real-time ray tracing is an exciting feature you're going to start seeing in games in the future, and we are supporting it officially as of the RTX 20 series, something along those lines.
Mm.
Which doesn't sound as good as the claims that Jensen made because he's a salesman. But if they merely said we now have hardware support for feature, then we'd be like, okay, that's pretty neat. That's cool. We'll see. We're not expecting much to come of that for this generation, but it's something they're supporting. We wouldn't have too much problem with it, right?
Yeah, like
It wasn't something that was used.
there's all sorts of new architectural features that are put in that don't get huge raving reviews about. Like, where was the pumping up of mesh shaders, for example? Like,
Mhm.
that's a feature that is slowly becoming more used in games at a technical level, but wasn't blasted around as this sort of next generation revolutionary feature. It just was something that the architecture could now support.
Mhm. Yeah, so the truth is it was weaponized.
Yeah.
There's no other way to put it, and that's why we are critical of those claims and of those products, because they didn't live up to the claims. I mean, as a reviewer, I feel like that's what we should do,
And
and we were skeptical of those claims at the time, and now looking back 8 years, we rightfully so.
yeah, and I
Like,
think you need to review these things later on as well, because a
mhm,
lot of the promise that was made about ray tracing, especially once it started to become criticized for the poor quality in games like Battlefield 5, was that it was this future looking technology. So it wasn't like, oh, this is all the really early stuff. Like, yeah, Battlefield 5, it runs like crap and the reflections are extremely noisy and it's not a good experience. But, this is a look of, no optimization work has been done. Over time, this is going to get better. And so, if that is the claim that's being made, it's fair to review it after a certain amount of time and sort of going, well, if the 20 series buyers were sold ray tracing and it was promised to be delivered at some point in the future, did that future ever arrive? And I think that we've shown over a number of videos, the video I made a few years ago looking at the 2060s performance in modern ray tracing games, and also just your video now has shown that, yeah, those people that bought those products didn't really get too much of a ray tracing experience. And some people, they've pointed to games that now use ray tracing by default and saying, well, a 2060 can launch these products and those sorts of things, which, I mean, I guess fair enough. If you're talking 6 years or 8 years later that your 2060 can now run modern games, I mean, that's nice, I guess, but is probably outside the lifespan of that product for most people. So for most of the card's life, most of the time people were using those before they upgrade to something newer. Yeah, the ray tracing experience hasn't been overly impressive in a lot of cases. And again, I think it all goes back to the marketing and the stuff that you were talking about how it was presented. Because there's really two worlds that we could have had, right? There's the world we got, which is Jensen heavily advertising ray tracing as being this important future of gaming feature. And then there's your way that you thought would have been a more successful way, which was sort of the whole, this is an optional feature that we're adding to our GPU hardware to enable the future of gaming at some point, sort of a more, I guess, dialed back tone for the whole thing. You know, when you're talking about ray tracing examples today and you're sort of looking at it, yeah, there are some great examples. And if gaming went down the path you were saying, the more dialed back version, there would have been this slow acceptance of, ray tracing is improving visuals. It's this top end feature that high end buyers can use. It's sort of the cream of the cream on top sort of thing, cherry on top of the
mhm,
cake
mhm.
that you can add in. And, over time, this will filter down to lower and lower tier hardware, but we're enabling these high quality features for the people that are spending the most money. Fair enough. But, this isn't the basis of our products, at least, for 20 and 30 series buyers. But again, that's not what happened though. That isn't what happened. What happened was it was pushed as a major game changer feature. And so it needs to be assessed based on, was it a major game changing feature? And even for me as a
Mhm.
single player gamer, looking across a lot of the titles that I played, there are some great examples of ray tracing if you have high end hardware to run path tracing and those sorts of features. But if you're trying to run games on like a 5060 Ti or a 4060 from the previous generation, those features are still out of reach for a lot of
Mhm.
gamers. And yes, again, have to acknowledge that there are some games that use ray tracing by default, like Assassin's Creed Shadows and Indiana Jones, and those games do run on low tier hardware, but that is not the current standard that we're seeing in the market at the moment. Most games do not, at this stage, use ray tracing by default. And so most games, again, throughout the lifespan of those cards, had the option to not use ray tracing. And on lower tier hardware, that was just a more, I guess, enjoyable, better experience for those gamers. And so Ma
Yeah, you also have to ask the question, have those games revolutionized computer graphics? Do you point to them as being significantly better than other games? Like, you would be expecting, based on what Jensen said back then, as more of a night and day experience.
Mhm,
And I just don't think we've got that. I think in a lot of these arguments, you're almost splitting hairs. And again, there are some very impressive examples. I'm not saying there isn't, but I'm talking in more general terms. And even those games, Star Wars Outlaws and stuff, I don't often open those games and think, whoa, this is a different caliber of game. Like, I'm running a 5090.
Mhm.
got it at 4K, got everything cranked up, and I don't like it's a good they're good looking games, but they don't seem to be a tier above other games. And even other games that don't use ray tracing at all, like some of the better examples we have graphically. I just I don't know. Am I crazy?
No. No, not at all.
I don't think wow, this has revolutionized computer graphics. Like we are looking at something significantly different here. This is a bit special. I don't get that at all.
Yeah, I think what we've seen over the last maybe decade of gaming is, and I know some people sort of criticized when we sort of said, maybe gaming graphics have reached a peak. But what I mean by,
Well, we weren't saying that, by the way. Gamers were saying
well,
that. We were
yeah, I
more.
mean, yeah, gamers have.
It was we were saying it was the sentiment from gamers.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we could talk about that maybe because I do see a lot of comments saying that,
Mhm.
why. I guess the thing that I see from more mainstream gaming, like outside of the PC gaming crowd, is maybe from console gamers is this focus of like, why are games being so expensive and taking so long to make when all they're working on are graphics features where when the gameplay, is fairly similar to older games and also the graphics aren't, as you sort of put it, a revolutionary step. So why are they spending all this money and time on these visual extravaganzas that maybe aren't as incredible considering the extra money and time that is being spent on them versus games from a decade ago? But to me, at least, I think you go back to like 2002 maybe, and games were extremely basic. And I think a lot of people, when they remember a game from 2002, are not going to be like, wow, that was realistic visuals, right? Like
Hmm.
I was playing a game and, maybe we switched over to the 3D era in that time. So gaming went from largely being 2D to 3D over the space of, many years. That is a pretty significant upgrade that you can remember and go, okay, games were 2D, now they're 3D, but they're not realistic 3D, they're just 3D. But then as we sort of got to maybe 10 years ago, games moved into this era where they're not realistic, obviously, but they're approaching a good enough level of realism that they can immerse you in the game in a way that feels like you're playing a realistic game. And
Mhm.
so, what I find a lot of people say is that they go, wow, didn't imagine a game from 10 years ago, didn't that game look amazing? And I don't think games look that different today. And that's an interesting thought
Mm.
because if you actually go back and look at games from a decade ago, you'll probably find that they look quite a bit worse than modern games in a lot of ways. Like they use very weird color filters, the lighting quality is really poor, texture quality is low, all those sorts of things. And there are some, outlier examples that have held up really well, but the majority of games don't look that good. But people
Mhm.
held it up in their minds as these sort of like, these were realistic games when I played them. Therefore, the memory that's gone into my brain is being I played a realistic game when I played Far Cry 3 or something right back in the day.
Yeah, we've talked about the nostalgia for
Yeah,
this sort of thing. It happens with old movies as
and so I
well.
think the sentiment that we're seeing from a lot of gamers today is that we're still in the almost real era. And so any change that you make in terms of the level of almost real that you're talking about doesn't affect people's memory of the games all that much. And so, of course, if you put a modern game with path tracing effects up against a game from a decade ago, path tracing games look significantly better in terms of the lighting quality, the realism, and everything. But I
Mhm.
think there's this sentiment from gamers in general that feels like it hasn't been a significant upgrade because all of the memories that they've had slowly over the last decade of gaming have been, well, in 2013, I played a realistic looking game. And then 2015, I played a realistic looking game, so on and so on till 2026. And so if you're in that mindset and you're sort of thinking about gaming as a whole and have we got that step upgrade like 2D to 3D graphics that people can really point to and be like, well, that's when gaming changed. Like when I went from playing Mario in 2D to playing Mario in 3D, that was a huge revolution for computer graphics at that time. People aren't, they don't have those core memories to go back to sort of accentuate that step change. And when you combine all of that with this feeling today that GPU hardware is so expensive that you can't run games that a lot of people want to play on modest hardware and that, optimization is really poor in a lot of games, Unreal Engine is ruining gaming or whatever people are claiming about that engine, right? You're kind of meshing all these opinions together and you can see why people are saying things like, ray tracing is pointless and bad because I remember games from a decade ago being looking great, But all I'm experiencing today are games that run worse for no clear benefit to me as a gamer. And I just want to play whatever game I'm interested in at a good frame rate. I don't want to spend $600 on a new GPU to run this game. Why doesn't it run on my 3060 or whatever? And
I think that the performance thing that you touched on is important because I lived through this and I very closely monitored the performance throughout that time because I've been a hardware reviewer for over 20 years. When we got those massive visual improvements, those really that redefined gaming, with it, we also got much more powerful GPUs that were affordable. So not only did the games look significantly better, but they played as well, or if not better, than the games that you were playing previously. Now, those games on the same modern hardware would also play faster, of course, but I'm talking about the, sort of the relative experience through time. So you played sort of crappier games on crappier hardware, and then you genuinely got better looking games on genuinely better hardware. So the entire experience was enriched. Whereas over the last whatever period you want to go, 5 to 10 years, the games have gotten a bit better in terms of looking. Subjective, we can argue. I'm generalizing. I think it's safe to say generally they have gotten a bit better. Now people will disagree or agree or whatever. And while the hardware has gotten more powerful, it hasn't gotten more powerful to the extent that you're getting the same type of experience that we were getting 5-10 years ago.
That's right.
Like we're getting to a point in time where the push was for high refresh rate gaming. That was exciting. The monitor, we got past 60 hertz. It was huge. I'd argue in a lot of ways that was that revolutionized gaming, at least in my opinion, more. Going to the smooth motion. It was mind blowing. I remember going to like 144 hertz for the first time. I couldn't believe it. It was like jumping off a hard drive and going to an SSD, for example. That was massive. And we were getting used to playing games at hundreds of frames per second. And it was great. And then now the graphics have improved, but now you're having to go, well, yeah, my base frame rate's 30 or 40, 50 FPS. I had DLSS. That gets me back above 60. So that's somewhat acceptable. And I guess I can enable frame generation. So I have the input latency of about 60 FPS, but the visual smoothness of ideally the kind of performance that I really want. Is it what gamers want? Evidently, no. And that circles back to what I was talking about at the start of the discussion when we first got ray tracing and people were hyped about it. I think that's a good way to put it when all this happened. People were genuinely excited and hyped for this revolution in computer graphics. They were all ready for it. They were pumped, primed, ready to go. And when we weren't fully drinking the Kool-Aid and jumping on board, like maybe some others were, that's where we started to get a lot of criticism. And I remember like the 20 series refresh, when we were doing our data for that, we were heavily criticized by, it seemed like, our own audience in the comment section as well as all these other places. But then we got to like the 30 series, and I think it was still I don't know, did you get the same vibe at the 30 series? We weren't pushing ray tracing as hard as maybe people were expecting, and there was a lot of pushback there. Like we were, I don't know, feel like there's a lot of criticism for not still being aboard the ray tracing train there more than I would expect based on the evidence at hand, I guess is one way to put it. And that's when we also copped the pushback from Nvidia. And I think then online perception started to change a bit. But then by the time we got to the GeForce 40 series, I noticed a really big shift in the way gamers, how accepting they were of ray tracing, or how hyped, how thirsty they were for ray tracing benchmarks. I don't know, I noticed a big shift around that time where although we had better examples and I felt like we were finally starting to get there with ray tracing, people seemed more uninterested than ever based on what we were seeing with polling data and just in the comment section. And now, we're in 2026 and we make this video that some people are very upset about or think is, I don't know what else. They're not liking it. But then, as I said, we've got the overwhelming response in the comment section from thousands of comments has been really positive. People have left really thoughtful, well-constructed comments where they're like, wow, you've really summarized my experience over the years as a Nvidia owner of like, I don't know, someone said like a 4070 Super or something. This is really, you've put into words my feelings. Like I was watching this video feeling like, yeah, this has been my lived experience. And it wasn't like one or two or a couple of people saying that. There was a lot of people saying that. And again, we've seen this from the polling data. So I feel like in a lot of ways we have gotten this right over the years with how important ray tracing is and, you know, how much of a feature, you know, it really is that you should, you know, weigh up when buying a GPU. So I know that's just, it's a weird situation where I would say we've definitely got some really transformative, super impressive examples. Admittedly, you know, they're mostly path tracing examples where you need like a 4090 or a 5090 to truly enjoy. But, you know, depending on your standards and whatever, you can probably get away with it with the 5070 Ti. But I feel like we're starting to get there now, and people, yeah, like I said, are less interested than ever en masse. And I don't know if you agree with this, but there seems to start, it seems to be exposing this disconnect between like real hardcore PC enthusiasts. I don't even know if that's an accurate way of putting it. I don't know. People that like to argue all day about PC hardware on Reddit and places like X, and I'm not really sure what more to say about that, but those types of people, there seems to be a growing disconnect between them and then just, how do you want to,
the normies,
gamers at large, normies, like, like people who primarily just want to play the games. It's kind of like the whole PC building, like overclockers, like tuners versus everybody else who just wants to build a computer and use it. Like, there's that huge divide these days.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that more and more now, like people, because we're not really conning people here or saying something you can't verify for yourself. Like, we are presenting some of this information as our opinion, and then some of the performance metrics or whatever, some of the stuff is fact. But it's not like me telling you how good an RTX 5090 is, or how fast a 9800X 3D is, or something where you physically need that specific piece of hardware to experience it. Now, you do need a ray tracing capable GPU. Let's say like it has to be a 9000 Radeon GPU or a GeForce GPU of the current or previous generation. But there are a lot of people, like, and again, if you believe the market research stuff, what is it, 95 or 99% or some crazy high 90% figure of people own a GeForce GPU. So we're talking to most people, or about most people, over this 8-year period, whether it's been the last few years, which is what I'm saying, where the sentiment has changed, people have gotten the hardware. Like, the gamers we're talking to have the gaming hardware. It's not like something that they have yet to experience for themselves. So many people have bought RTX 4070s, 4070 Supers, you name it. Pick a model. People have bought it. They've bought the games. They've tried it with them without ray tracing. They've, you know, some people do like the experience. Like, the opinions on this vary from, I've tried ray tracing in a whole heap of games on my GeForce GPU, and I've concluded it sucks. I don't like the performance hit. I want to be able to enjoy high refresh rate gaming. It's not worth it. Or I don't like the noise or whatever. And then there are people who are like, I actually really like the ray tracing in these games. But the problem is it's just these games and not all of the games I like to play. And that's another point that gets lost in this. Like, the people who like to defend ray tracing or whatever and say that we don't know what we're talking about and we're crazy, they'll point to like 4 different games that we agree are truly transformative that are 4 wildly different games, and it's unlikely that you are going to play all 4 of those games as a GeForce owner, thoroughly enjoy them, and sink a huge amount of time into all of them. Like, imagine if the truly transformative experience was Fortnite and, I don't know, Cyberpunk. There's not going to be possibly a huge amount of overlap where, like, which, for example, you would certainly play one of those games and not the other. So realistically for you, there's not 2 transformative examples, there's 1. So,
I think over time there's been, and sort of going back to your point about, the whole gamers turning on it a little bit.
mhm,
I think what you see from a lot of the enthusiast crowd that gets really upset about, I don't know, criticism of ray tracing and that sort of thing is that enthusiasts, they spend a bit more on their PC hardware. They're more into it. It's the main hobby of those people or whatever, and they generally have better rigs. And so there's if you have over time bought relatively high end Nvidia hardware, so 2080 Ti's back in the day, maybe you moved to a 3080 or 3090, and you continued at that top class of GeForce GPUs,
mhm,
over time, you have been able to experience ray tracing in games at the time to some degree, especially if you've bought
mhm,
the flagship GPUs. Because of course, games over time, they haven't really released features that have just been completely unusable on the GPUs at the time. But often the highest end ray tracing features have required 3090s or whatever. So if you're in that class, you're going to have a very different opinion on how usable a feature like ray tracing is because you've had the hardware to actually run it and experience it in a way that isn't completely awful. And
but you'd also have to be a type of gamer that's played those specific
sure,
games
sure.
and
Yeah, yeah.
enjoyed
But
them.
I'm just saying that for
Mhm,
people who are really into PC gaming, they're more likely to be the gamers with the best of the best hardware and joining
mhm,
in discussions about hardware, about ray tracing, more likely to be owners of these expensive GPUs. And certainly our audience is as well probably more skewed towards the higher end buyers than the general market. I think what this
mhm,
is really exposed, and the reason why we see a lot of the difference in feedback between the enthusiast communities and more general gamers, is that there is a ray tracing class divide. If you've been a high end gamer for all that time, ray tracing has been accessible to you. But if you've been a mid range to lower spec gamer, buying things like 4060s and that class of hardware, ray tracing has largely been inaccessible to you. So, as you said about how people have been buying GPUs and they now have the opportunity to use ray tracing for themselves because they own an RTX GPU and they're playing games where this feature is available. If you're doing that on 4060 class hardware, it's no surprise that you don't think the experience is that great because the game is like modern games, a lot of them struggle to run at good resolutions and frame rates on that tier of hardware without ray tracing. So, there's no real room to run ray tracing. And so this creates this big divide between the people that can do it and the people that can't. And because the people that own mid-range to lower tier hardware is the vast majority of the PC gaming market. Like you can look at the Steam hardware surveys. You know what Valve has claimed about the Steam machine, about how 50% of people or whatever they claimed was the percentage was that have hardware that's as good or worse than the Steam machine, which is a very low spec piece of hardware by modern standards. These are the gamers that can use these features now and can experience it for themselves and are not getting necessarily the best experience. And I think the reason why it's all turned is that back in the day, right, the 20 series tech demo for people buying a 2060, but there was the promise that at some point in the future, someone buying an affordable GPU will be able to use ray tracing to a decent extent. And you probably would have thought that 3 generations of GPU hardware later in the 50 series, that might have been somewhat of a reality because I think that's a fair enough amount of time to get large performance improvements in the low end of the hardware so that you can run these features. But no, it hasn't happened. Improvements to mid range and low tier hardware. That is the key missing ingredient that NVIDIA and I guess AMD to some degree as well haven't been able to actually deliver on the ray tracing promise. If you're going to
mm,
promise this as a feature that all gamers are going to use, but then 8 years later you're not providing the hardware so that gamers can actually use the feature, you failed. There's
mhm,
just no way around that. Like the lack of and this is something we've been banging on for so long now. The lack of advancement in mid range to low tier hardware, the widening of the gap, the making of those high end GPUs more and more expensive, trying to encourage people into higher tiers, first of all, it doesn't really work because people just still buy the low tier hardware. And then it means that these features that you've sold people on, people start getting frustrated in because they're seeing a feature and they're like, I've heard about this ray tracing thing, my everyone's talking about RTX and stuff, but why can't my 4050 or 40 or 5050 do it? And it's because
8 gigs of VRAM.
it's because it's a low end GPU that isn't designed, hasn't been built to do it necessarily all that well. But then again, like what you were saying from maybe 20 years ago, when we got these big hardware, when we got these big graphical advancements, we also got big hardware advancements. And so people on more modest hardware weren't necessarily buying, well, first of all, the high-end stuff wasn't as expensive, but also people just buying generally a GPU could enjoy a lot of these new features. But because things have stagnated, they're trying to, NVIDIA's trying to wring money out of you. They're trying to extract as many dollars as they possibly can from you. It's created this ecosystem where people, like I said, the class divide, that people are turning on it a little bit. And the general sentiment from people that don't have this incredible high-end hardware is that ray tracing hasn't done all that much for the games that they want to play. And if anything, the focus of developers on ray tracing and on making games, using Unreal Engine, enabling all the Lumen features and Nanite and everything, has made games less accessible, harder to run, less enjoyable on mid-range hardware. And, we see all that sentiment with all this talk of optimization. Games are poorly optimized now. Game developers are lazy. They don't put any time and effort into Unreal Engine sucks. All that argument, again, stems back to it's all a similar sort of, I guess, opinion in the way that I see it. So I guess that's sort of my thoughts on why, we might be seeing and why at least there's such a large difference between the opinions that you can read from maybe mainstream gamers versus the people commenting on Reddit, for example.
Yep. Yeah, I would just, again, touch on, just to summarize it, example, I saw a lot of criticism that we used Fortnite, that discredits us straight away, so on and so forth. Just for those interested, Fortnite was used as an example of a competitive shooter that does actually support hardware-based ray tracing, but no one, I would say, serious about playing the game, like if you really want to win the game, would actually use it. And I gave clear examples in the video for why that would be. It places you at multiple different serious disadvantages, and therefore ray tracing hasn't revolutionized gaming as a whole, and it certainly doesn't make a game like Fortnite better to play. But Fortnite was just one example. I gave another example in Call of Duty that also has ray tracing, but again, you wouldn't use ray tracing in Call of Duty unless you're playing maybe the single player campaign. But
I don't think it's even enabled in, at least the modern ones. I don't think you can even use it in the multiplayer mode.
No, I was talking about, when they got it for Shadows in Modern Warfare. And so anyway, but they were two examples that I gave within the video, but I focused more on Fortnite because that's still a current example, I suppose, is one way to put it. But then, as we've touched on, a lot of those games don't even support ray tracing because it doesn't make sense for them to support ray tracing, which includes popular games like Apex Legends, Valorant, Counter-Strike 2, and Battlefield 6, which we've touched on. So Fortnite was just used as an example of a genre style of game where ray tracing isn't used because it doesn't really make sense to. Now, like if we got to a future, however many years into the future, where these game engines just used ray tracing by default because it was easier to, do lighting and things, and that was the baseline, the default, because eventually we will get to that reality. Like games will just be better than they are today because of, hardware and progress and whatnot. Then fine. That doesn't really help out someone who bought an RTX 20 series or 30 series GPU. So when we were asking the question, was ray tracing a scam? Essentially, our answer was gamers who bought an early RTX GPU specifically for ray tracing, because that was the primary promise, the primary feature of those GPUs. DLSS turned out to be, a great feature, which we've been pretty on board with since they got to DLSS 2.0. But we were saying those people essentially got scammed, as those particular GPUs were never powerful enough to play modern ray trace games. And since then, the technology hasn't become like a universal baseline that Nvidia promised 8 years ago now. So we were reviewing 8 years of that progress, which is why, again, we didn't focus on path tracing in the latest games, because as noted in that video, we do deem those to be transformative, and with a few caveats, like you need high-end hardware.
Path tracing wasn't available or even really on the horizon at the launch of the RTX.
Yeah, it's a totally different thing. And the video clearly wasn't talking about that, because
it wasn't, the video wasn't is ray tracing a scam on a technical level? You know, does it work or not work? It was it advertised to gamers in a way that was scam like? That was the point of the
Yeah.
video. Uh,
Yeah, I think it's fair to say Nvidia tried to weaponize ray tracing. They absolutely shoved it down the throats of gamers, and worst of all, well, yeah, they did their absolute best to manipulate reviewers.
mhm,
Lots of reviewers were pressured by Nvidia to start using ray tracing 100% for their benchmarking. Like,
mhm.
they tried that with us, and when we resisted that, they did blacklist us.
Mhm.
So I mean, people will get up in arms and because I said Nvidia tried to weaponize ray tracing and they'll lose their minds, but they blacklisted us for not pushing ray tracing on our audience back then.
Mhm.
And now today, the vast majority of people seem to agree with our stance on it.
Yeah, and
So,
I mean, again, you're sort of bringing up, you know, these games like Fortnite and stuff and Battlefield 6 don't use ray tracing. It kind of, again, just goes back to my point about how mid-range hardware hasn't advanced, because if Nvidia had given gamers much more powerful mid-range and entry-level hardware that was ray tracing capable, you might have seen a game like Battlefield 6 move towards using ray tracing in all of the modes. But because they haven't done that, they haven't given you what you actually need to use the feature that they promised. It's worse for a game developer to integrate ray tracing into those titles, because the only path to success for a multiplayer game at the moment is getting the game into as the hands of as many gamers as possible. You need to target as the widest possible user base, and that means having a game engine that's extremely efficient, scales really well to very low tier hardware, and just gives you a nice stutter free enjoyable experience. And if you look at all the
mhm,
popular games and most of the multiplayer games coming out today, they all fit that criteria. They're designed specifically to target a wide audience. And that wide audience, if mid range and entry level hardware was much better today than it was all those years ago, that audience they could have targeted might have been ray tracing hardware, but it's not,
yep,
because they didn't give us better mid-range and entry-level hardware. And then again, like for some types of games, for some styles of games, even with ray tracing in the game engine by default, it may not necessarily have needed ray tracing from a visual standpoint. You know, the way that they're implementing shadows or other lighting effects might have been done using rasterization easily. Of course, I guess the point at that point would be, well, ray tracing is, you know, even more efficient and easy for developers to use, so that's why you'd put it into the engine. But certainly a game like, you know, Counter-Strike 2, I wouldn't have thought would ever require ray tracing level visuals for the style that they went with for that game. You know, a game like Dota 2 doesn't need ray tracing to be an enjoyable experience in that game. And for the visuals, it doesn't really, like, there's no reason to put that feature in the game, especially because today ray tracing is, I would describe as, I guess, fairly inefficient compared to rasterization to get that level of visuals. Like if you're targeting fairly basic lighting, nothing crazy is going on, I don't really see why you would use ray tracing when efficient rasterization exists and allows you to run the game at a much higher frame rate. Ray tracing is really to do things beyond what rasterization is capable of, you know, in terms of the accuracy and realism of lighting. And so, yeah, I mean,
yeah, that's an interesting one. I haven't played Counter Strike. Well, I haven't played Counter Strike 2 really. I played the original Counter Strike quite a bit with
mhm,
friends, but this is going back a very long time. And if you had really realistic lighting and bloom effects and stuff, that could create like a map imbalance where peaking on certain spots that would either benefit the peaker or disadvantage them depending on whether like the sun's shining in their face or not.
mm,
That could create some weird map imbalances. Not sure about that one. Again, I haven't played enough, but in a game like Fortnite, for example, which you to sort of touch on what you were just speaking about, in that example, I actually would rather Fortnite be the ray traced version. I think it looks way better.
mhm,
I think the game looking visually better, despite the fact that it does make the game harder to play, is kind of neat. Like
mhm.
I like that. I would prefer if you gave me the option of everyone playing in performance mode or the epic settings with ray tracing enabled, I'd actually pick the ray tracing option because it looks amazing
Mhm.
and it's harder to play. Now, I would like the performance of performance mode, as in the frame rates, but I prefer the look of the ray tracing. I think it looks amazing.
Yeah, if you're saying that if both modes were at the exact same performance, you would pick purely based on visuals the ray tracing option.
Yes, but everybody, that would have to be the minimum spec.
Because you at a competitive disadvantage, so you would never use it. Yeah.
That's right. So if you had some mod that stripped stuff out, that would be cheating and you'd be banned for it. So by default, the minimum spec would be what we see with the ray tracing visuals. I'd be all for that. The game would be more difficult to play, but it would be more difficult to play for everybody. And it would just, it just looks better, and I don't think the game would play any worse for having to wait another second for builds to clear when they're broken, like having an actual animation effect rather than just flat disappear, which is what they do in the performance mode. So, yeah, I'm not against ray tracing, but it doesn't make sense in a game like Fortnite when you can use the performance mode, and people will say, well, why do they have the performance mode? You know, that should be the base. Yeah, and the reason for that is because, for example, in Fortnite, using the epic quality settings with ray tracing at 1440p, you're getting under 100 frames per second with a 5070 Ti or a 9070 XT. So with I don't know, quality upscaling, you'll get just over 100 frames per second, which sounds like a lot, but you want 1% lows of 200 FPS in Fortnite. So at 1440p in the performance mode, you're getting 1% lows with a 9800X 3D of almost 400 FPS, which is more than I need, but I need a minimum. I can very much tell the difference from 100 to 200, like it's night and day. Even from 150 to 200 is a big difference. So the reason they have the performance mode is, which you just said, Tim, is so people can play it, so they can cater to a wider audience. So if PC hardware was much better than it is today, which would make console hardware better, right?
Yep.
It would make all hardware better. We might have that future where you could play Fortnite using ray tracing. As it stands.
Yeah, I mean, multiplayer games at some point are going to do that. It's just, it requires the baseline level of hardware. And I think we're probably, I would say, maybe 2 console generations away from that being a reality for multiplayer games, just at a guess. So we're probably talking
more than a decade.
Probably talking 15 years. And the reason why I'm saying that is, I think it's quite likely when the next generation consoles, the PlayStation 6 or whatever comes out, that a lot of the multiplayer games will be cross-platform for a long time. So running on both the PlayStation 6 and the PlayStation 5. Of course, the PlayStation 5 is not really sufficient for ray tracing in a multiplayer game at high frame rates. So I would think that, games are going to maybe give an optional better quality mode if you're playing it on a PS6, but the base spec for those games is still going to be PS5 level. And so it'll really take until the PS7, which will then have the PS6 as the base spec, because apparently the next consoles are going to have much better ray tracing hardware in them and all that sort of thing. So I think it'll be by the time that we see the PlayStation 7 being released, that is when the majority of people's base hardware that they're playing games on will be sufficient to allow developers to create multiplayer titles where ray tracing is the minimum spec for everyone, where there's not massive visual downgrades for people on the level of Fortnite's, performance mode sort of thing. Because again, there's probably game engines that are being worked on for multiplayer titles that are ray tracing only, but I think that for the lower spec gamers, they're probably looking at fairly low quality implementations of ray tracing, like, if you go into Star Wars Outlaws and run on the low preset, or Avatar on the low preset, those sort of games, they're not exactly amazing showcases of ray tracing when you use those configurations, but the engine obviously still uses it. So, I think that's probably how far away we are from the multiplayer side of things becoming sort of this ray tracing era. So 15 years, which will be a total of, more than, it'll be like almost,
23 years, something
like that. Yeah. So it's a long
over
path.
20 years, safe to say. It's, well, I am sure back then we said this will be at least 2 decades away. I know we've said that multiple times. There's no guarantee it'll be that, by the way, but it'll be at least that.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Well, unless you have any further thoughts about ray tracing, we can probably put that conversation to bed for this year. Hopefully, we don't have to revisit this anytime soon because we've set our piece on ray tracing for now. But
Well, we'll see. But no, that's pretty much what I wanted to discuss about the feedback from the video and just what we'd been seeing.
yeah, well, hopefully people enjoyed our expanded thoughts on that topic. We'll take a break and we'll come back and we'll talk about our boring lives. All right, Steve, you're going to have to carry this section because, like last week, I'm a new father, so that's my whole life now. That's all I've been doing, really, apart from making videos for the channel. So, what on earth have you been up to?
Yeah, I've been doing more than just nappies and bottle feeding.
Yeah.
But no, that's all good stuff. What have I done? I've done a few different things. We got Mother's Day coming up, and my wife has a table that she's wanted to sort of restore, renovate, whatever you want to call it, for many, many, many years. So it's got a bit of a history, this table, but she decided to finally bite the bullet. We took it outside. She sanded it all down, and the idea was to take it. It was like a dark stain. I don't know if I've got a photo of what it used to look like. If I do, maybe we'll put it in the YouTube version. But it was a dark stained timber, and we've gone for sort of a light, more natural timber finish in the house after renovating it. So she wanted to sand it down, see what it looked like, and then just give it like a clear coat, a durable clear coat. So that's what she did. The problem we had with the table was it was very warped. So the history on this table was when we built our first house and all that about 15 years ago now, didn't have that much money to spend on furniture. So we did like the eBay, the secondhand furniture shopping thing. And we ended up driving out with a trailer to one of the wealthier suburbs. A lady was selling a hardwood table, like a 2.4 meter by 1.2 meter-ish table, quite a large kitchen table. She said she paid thousands of dollars for it, which I absolutely believed. We ended up getting $50. So it was
good deal.
Yeah, it was like Christmas Eve or leading up to that. She'd ordered, and she was hosting Christmas or something. She'd ordered a new, very fancy, expensive table. Had to get rid of this one. We'd been watching it. It was up in eBay a few weeks prior. It started like $500. Then she dropped it to $300. I messaged her like a couple of days before Christmas and said, hey, would you take $50 for it? Sort of a cheeky kind of, extreme lowball offer. And she's like, if you can take it tonight, it's yours. I was like, done. So we grabbed the in-laws trailer, chucked it on the car, drove like an hour or so down there. Got this table, was pretty impressed with the quality of, like I said, hardwood kitchen table, quite nice, $50, absolute ripper. And we've had it in our house now for about 15 years. But because the table would be a few decades old now, and where it is in our kitchen, it gets hit with direct light in the afternoons, the timber had sort of started to warp just a little bit. It actually quite a lot, to be fair, because it's like I said, it's 2.4 meters long. So on the 2.4 meter axis, it had bananaed, like caved in like a bowl in the middle. I would say close to 10 mil over the 2.4 meters by the middle. So it was quite a big dip. You didn't really notice it right away, but if you're looking for it, you'd notice it. And then in the middle, it kind of bowed inwards as well. So it was caving in on itself a bit. The timber reinforcing it underneath wasn't particularly great. So I said to my wife, we'll take the whole table apart, you sand the whole thing down, and I will weld up a steel reinforced frame for it, and we'll panel bond that and then screw it to the underside of the essentially laminated hardwood paneling, which will hopefully straighten it out. I don't know. We'll see. So anyway, yesterday I welded that whole frame up for her because that was her Mother's Day present. That's what she really wanted.
Oh yeah, nice.
So I put work on pause for a couple of hours, welded up a nice square flat frame, and used some panel bond glue and then a couple of hundred small, like 20 mil screws because I couldn't go the whole way through. That was another challenge. Anyway, I did that. We basically emptied the Harbour Unboxed gym of all of its plate weights, chucked it all over the steel frame. So I put the glue on it, then flattened the timber down with the frame and then screwed it once it was flattened down, and then left it there for 24 hours for the panel bond to go off and all that. Anyway, flipped it over. It's like flat as a tack. You can walk on it now. It's that strong with the steel structure under it, and you can't see the steel, so it's hidden within the table. Looks really good. And yeah, just got to give it one more sand down, another clear coat, and it should be good to go. So she's extremely happy. She's over the moon with it. So
nice. Yeah, it sounds like,
like I said,
a good little project there.
Yeah, came out really well. So, I mean, it's probably not going to appeal to everyone. Some people would probably prefer the darker stain, which she could have done. She could have stained the timber again, but she wanted to go with the natural sanded timber look and then just clear coat it. It does match the floors pretty well. Anyway, she's happy with it. So that's the main thing. I don't really care. It looks better. There was also some splits in the timber as well, which, we used some timber glue and clamped them back up and fixed all of that. And that, to my surprise, worked a treat.
Nice.
It's flawless now. I don't even know where they were. It worked that well. There was 2 big splits in it. So yeah, restored the table. It didn't really take too long. Admittedly, my wife did 90%, 99% of all the hard work of sanding the whole thing back and whatever. And
it's partly a gift and partly go to work doing stuff to make your gift a reality sort of thing.
Well, she was like, I need to get all the warping out of it. There's no point putting it back together the way it was. And she couldn't fix the splits in it. So she's like, can you fix the splits in it? And can you come up with some way of making this timber not warped?
Yeah.
I was like, well, that's a challenge. But anyway, as it went incredibly well. So
nice.
To my surprise, it turned out very good. So anyway, that's one of my boring life stories. We restored a table. So rather than spend thousands of dollars on a new one and get some new timber in and have other trees cut down for that, we have restored a decades old hardwood table, and it'll have if it's kept inside, this thing should last forever because the steel frame I put under there, it ain't warping again. Like it ain't splitting, it ain't warping. That table is, I've done it pretty much the way it should have been done from the start, because it just, the timber structure that was used to reinforce the table just wasn't going to be strong enough long term. It just sagged with the table.
Yeah, okay.
Whereas now you could use it as a tap dancing stage if you wanted to. Like it's that solid, it's absurd, but it's good. So
nice.
She's happy. That's the main thing. So I get to live another day, Tim.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's not too much to talk about in the boring life section at the moment. So that'll probably do it for this week's episode. Again, we're just sort of taking it easy up until the lead up to Computex because not a whole lot is happening. So there'll be episodes every now and then. But then at Computex, we'll see what's going to happen then because it may not be the most exciting show, but we'll get back into the swing of it around then. So thanks everyone that's listened to the podcast to the end of this episode. We always appreciate everyone improving the watch time on our channel, let's be honest. But apart from that, if you do want to support Hardware Unboxed, we've got Patreon. You can sign up in the description. If you join, you get access to the ad-free version of this podcast and several other benefits, the usual Discord stuff, all the things you hear on our normal main channel videos. So yeah, that'll do it for this one. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.